January 6th didn't come out of the blue. It was not an act of God. It was not something that came from foreign soil. It wasn't even just some mere protest that got out of hand. No, 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 no. January 6th was an attempt to reverse, through violent means, the outcome of a free and fair election. An insurrection. Call it what it is, what it was. And it was fundamentally rooted in Donald Trump's big lie that the election of 2020 was illegitimate, in deep offense to the peaceful transfer of power. Indeed, in deep offense to the very notion of truth itself. And anyone who thinks that the origins of this insurrection are going away should just have listened a few moments ago when Donald Trump did it again, lying and lying and lying about the election. A clear reminder that the threat he and his lie remain to our nation. Alarmingly, many of his supporters quickly embraced the lie in the aftermath of the 2020 election. Many of them truly believed and still believe that he won the election and the game was rigged. Not a small number, large numbers of Americans. If you look at the polls, tens of millions. It didn't matter there was no proof to any of these claims. Donald Trump kept saying it and saying it and saying it again. And he called his supporters to rally here in Washington in a ditch effort to stay in power. We all know this. That's what happened. We can't forget it. It was Donald Trump's big lie that soaked our political landscape in kerosene. It was Donald Trump's rally on the Mall that struck the match. And then came the fire. And pouring gasoline on that fire are many in one branch of our media who spread the big lie then and continue to spread the big lie, even though they know it's false. And millions listen to these people and believe it. Here, too, is another terrible truth. The disease of the big lie continues to this day. The attacks on our democracy are ongoing. If not by the force of baseball bats and pipe bombs, then certainly through a quieter and much more organized effort to subvert democracy from the bottom up. Just as the big lie inspired the attack of January 6th, the big lie continues like a disease across state legislatures throughout the country, where we're seeing the most restrictive voter suppression efforts since Jim Crow in 21st century America, turning the clock way back. Let's be abundantly clear. These new anti-voter laws are on the books today only because their authors cited the big lie, cited the fictitious bugaboo of voter fraud, and are trying to succeed where the insurrection failed. Unless we confront the big lie, unless we all do our part to fortify and strengthen our democracy, the political violence of January 6th risks becoming not an aberration, but, God forbid, the norm. And we've seen it, too, in the threats against election workers, teachers, school administrators, healthcare workers. We cannot put our heads in the sand. We cannot brush this over. And what does that mean for the Senate? I think we have to talk about the realities here today, too. It means we must pass legislation, effective legislation, to defend our democracy, to protect the right to vote. We must pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act so that our country's destiny is determined by the voice of the people and not by the violent whims of lies and even mob rule. We must also guard against the false hopes of solutions that don't deal with the problem, that try to cover it up or push it away because people don't want to deal with it. Some say the answer lies in doing the bare minimum, like reforming the Electoral Count Act that my friend, the Republican leader, has floated in recent days. Let me take this opportunity to make clear that that plan, the McConnell plan, that's what it is unacceptably insufficient and even offensive. Some scorekeeping matters little if the game is rigged. And as we know too well, state legislatures are working day and night to undermine our democratic process from the get-go by empowering partisans to potentially say which ballots count and which do not. What good is it to accurately count a result that's compromised from the start? Senator McConnell's plan to reform the Electoral Count Act would do nothing more than codify the Vice President's ceremonial role in counting of the Electoral College votes, effectively guaranteeing that partisan state legislatures could overturn the elections without fear of recourse. Look at what it does. Look at what it does. It's a cynical idea. It's an idea to divert attention from the real issue because they don't want to confront the real issue. This cannot be, this should not be about one party versus another. Voting rights has always been bipartisan, supported by Bush, H.W. and W., supported by Reagan, passing this chamber with large votes from both sides of the aisle. That's what always used to happen until the Republican Party was taken over by Donald Trump. So, it's not about one party versus another. It can't be. It's about one terrible lie against democracy itself, the kind of lie that, if let stand, both verbally and in action, erodes our democracy, erodes our democracy. If a majority of people, there's already a substantial minority who don't believe our elections are legitimate, aided and egged on by Donald Trump and the right-wing media. What if a majority of this country, because of these pernicious actions, start believing it? A majority of Americans don't believe that elections are on the level? Just ask yourself, what will happen? I can't predict the details, but I can predict that it will diminish the greatness of this country in small and even large ways. So we cannot, this should not be a partisan issue. It's about falsehood versus truth. In the history of this country, we have always disagreed on ideology, but never on facts, until recently, and in such an important area. If lying about results of an election is acceptable, if instigating a mob against the government is considered permissible, if encouraging political violence becomes the norm, it will be open season on this grand democracy, this noble experiment, and everything will be up for grabs by whoever has the biggest clubs, the sharpest spears, the most effective lies. I do not believe that that is the ultimate destiny of our country. The mob may be strong, but the counter is stronger. The roots of democracy, the feelings of the American people, and the affection and love for this grand, noble experiment in democracy is stronger as long as we speak out, as long as we act. The wellspring of democracy is deep, and even in the most difficult of times, Americans have rallied and risen to the occasion. Since the early days of our republic, Americans launched mighty movements, fought a bloody civil war, and yes, passed federal election laws and voting rights laws to expand the promise of democracy until there were no more boundaries. We are called on, importuned by the millions who have lost their lives to defend this democracy, to defend it once again. I call on all Americans, Democrats, Republicans, independents, to rise to the occasion and assure that the mob, the violence, the lies do not win the day. Let the anniversary of January 6th forever serve as a reminder that the march to perfect our democracy is never over, that our democracy is a precious, sometimes fragile gift purchased by those who struggled before us, and that all of us now must do our part to keep the American vision going in the present and into the future. Somehow, in ways I can't predict, but I know are true, I am certain that God's mysterious hand will guide us, and truth and right will prevail. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Schumer, for your leadership and your work and your words today. As I stand here, I look at the faces of the staff. I remember the moment when we were pushed out of this chamber for security reasons. I remember the word of one staff member, Lee, who yelled out, "Take the boxes, take the boxes." She was talking about the mahogany boxes that were filled with the electoral ballots because we knew they would be destroyed if they were left behind. I remember my own staff, one of them is here today, hearing their stories of being in a closet, hiding in a closet with only forks that happened to be next door to protect themselves, right next to the doors where the insurrectionists had invaded. I remember the staff throughout this building that were marooned in places, and the faces of the police officers, the cuts on their faces, the anguish in the words of Officer Dunn, who said at the end of the day that he had been called the N-word multiple times, and that he had looked to his friend as they collapsed in the rotunda and said, "Is this America? Is this America?" The haunting words of the police officer on the police radio that was heard broadcast in the middle of the whole thing, "Is there a plan? Is there a plan?" There were many breakdowns that day, but the biggest breakdown was the breakdown of our democracy, that some people actually felt that they could take the law into their own hands, that they could invade not just a building, but our very republic. I look back at the words and the speeches that people gave that day, not only after the insurrection, but what was telling was what they said before it started. And I think I would urge people to look at those speeches. That discussion that we were having about this had been raging for weeks and for months. I remember standing at this very place right before we closed down the Senate because of the insurrection and going through the facts about how President-elect Biden at the time had won more votes than any president in history, the facts that 10 living defense secretaries had actually stood up at the time, including both of Donald Trump's defense secretaries, including people like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld and William Cohen, and came together and said that the scurrilous attacks on our democracy must stop and we must allow for the peaceful transition of power. And then I looked at the very end of my remarks, and I ended with this, right before we were invaded. I said this: my friend Roy Blunt, who I still have immense respect for what he did that evening, my friend Roy Blunt, my fellow Rules Committee leader, many years ago found a statue, a bust of a man at the top of a bookcase. He did research, he went to the historians, and all he could find out was that no one knew who this guy was, except that he was a cleric. Hence, the statue is called the Unknown Cleric. Now, at the time, the leaders in this great place thought this man important enough that they would warrant a statue for him. But today, no one knows who he is. Senator Blunt's message to school kids and senators alike that visit his office when he shows them the statue, what we do here is more important than who we are. And I ended with this: senators, what matters is not our futures, not our short-term destinies. What matters is our democracy's destiny. Because I think many of us know that people will not know who we are 100 years from now or 200 years from now. But what they will know is this: they will know what we did today, how we voted today, and that is more important than who we are. As someone once said, it's a republic if we can keep it. It's a republic if we can keep it. Those words ring more true now than they did a year ago. Because as we know, the haunting shrieks of the police that day, the officer pinned between the doors at the end of rioters, there were people that stood up for our republic, and there were people that attacked our republic. I remember Captain Carnicia Mendoza, a 19-year veteran of the Capitol Police who testified before the Rules Committee, who suffered chemical burns to her face while commanding the officers in the rotunda while they struggled to hold the doors open. Or who can forget Officer Eugene Goodman, who after saving Senator Romney from walking directly into the mob, ran by himself to take on a group of rioters with his baton and then diverted that mob away from the Senate chamber, allowing us to safely depart. Mr. President, who can forget the image right there where you sit on that dais of the insurrectionists rifling through papers on people's desks, opening up their offices and desks. Tragically, 5 officers who reported for duty have since passed away. 5 officers. You wonder why you see sad faces today on many people in this building who were their friends. Capitol Police Officer Brian Sicknick, who died the day after the attack. 4 other officers died in the days and months that followed. Capitol Police Officer Howard Liebengood, DC Metropolitan Police Officers Jeffrey Smith, Gunther Hashida, and Kyle DeFreitag. Many more suffered physical injuries and even more sustained emotional trauma from the events of that day. And we also remember, of course, Officer Billy Evans, who tragically died doing his job at his post in April. Recognizing the sacrifice of those heroes to defend our democracy is the least we can do. Senator Blunt and I led legislation. It's the support of our leaders, honoring those who protected the Capitol on January 6th with the Congressional Gold Medal. It was an honor to stand with officers and their families in August as President Biden signed this bill into law. We have made many, many improvements to the security of the Capitol. I think it's very important for staff and officers alike and those who work there to know that. I want to thank Senator Schumer for his work in installing a new Sergeant-at-Arms, Karen Gibson for the Senate. We have General Walker over in the House, and we have a new police chief, Chief Manger, who did an excellent job yesterday in describing the changes. We know there are many challenges ahead. Last but not least is that we do not have enough police officers right now to fill vacancies. So people are working double shifts, they're working vacations, they're canceling vacations. We have over 400 openings, an experience that many police departments throughout the country have right now, but one that is very important, and the chief has committed to fill those vacancies. But what have we done? The progress? Well, we have, 1, gotten the new personnel in. 2, we have passed a law in this chamber and signed into law by President Biden that makes it easier for the chief to call in the National Guard in a case of emergency. We have made sure that there's operational plans in place, as there were this summer when major events occur. And one of the saddest memories of that day was the fact that 75% of the police officers asked to defend this Capitol were in plain clothes. 75%. In many cases, they had less protective gear on than the invaders of the Capitol. That has changed. No more equipment that's going to be locked on a bus that they can't access. Senator Leahy's leadership with appropriations, Senator Shelby's leadership, we've been able to obtain more funding to get them the equipment that they need. All of those things are important. But as Senator Schumer noted, the other piece of this is our democracy itself. And that means getting to the bottom of what happened. Something is happening right now with the House Select Committee that is working to get the facts. And we would have loved to have an independent commission like the 9/11 Commission to do that, but they are doing that work over in the House. Yesterday, we heard from Attorney General Garland, who pledged to look at this at every level and to go where the facts will lead. Those were his words. Accountability at every level for what happened here is key. And it is the largest investigation we've seen in the history of America. Over 700 people that have been charged. That is a big piece of this work as well, accountability. And as Senator Schumer noted, this is also about carrying on the torch of our democracy. The voting rights legislation that we are working on right now couldn't be more important, because what was not accomplished with bear spray and bayonets has now been passed on to others to pass bills, as we've seen in Wisconsin, where a bill actually passed that would have allowed for only one ballot drop-off box in the entire city of Milwaukee. That one was vetoed by Governor Evers. But others have passed in states like Georgia, in states like Texas, and across this country, a concerted effort to undermine our democracy. So it is on us, when we take an oath to defend the Constitution of the United States, no matter what party we're in, to hold our democracy dear. It is a precious, precious thing, and it is very fragile, and it is in our hands to protect, just as our police officers protected it on January 6th. When you've got 9,600 threats against members of Congress, double what it has ever been in the past, that's not a small thing. That is January 6th continued. When you have election officials that have to leave their posts because, in the words of the election official from the city of Philadelphia, that his own family was threatened, their names, their addresses, their house put out on the internet. Katie Hobbs, Secretary of State in Arizona, receiving a voicemail saying, "I'm a hunter, and I think you should be hunted." People in rural areas that are elected officials that cannot have the kind of security that people may have in this building. That's January 6th continued, and we cannot forget our duty going forward. I will end with that image that I will always cherish, and the hope that democracy will prevail at 3:30 in the morning when Senator Blunt and I and Vice President Pence took that long walk over to the House with the two young women with the mahogany box filled with the last of the electoral ballots up through Wyoming. There was broken glass on all sides. There was spray paint on statues. It was the same walk we had taken in the morning, which had been so joyful, the celebration of our democracy, so ceremonial. And there we were, the last ones left, taking that walk into the House chambers where we finished our job. So when I look back at that day, that is the lasting image, that in the end, democracy prevailed, that in 2 weeks later, there we were under that beautiful blue sky with leaders of both parties on that inaugural stage saying that, yes, our democracy stood tall. It brushed itself off, and we move forward as one nation under God with liberty and justice for all, as we always do. And that is a spirit with which we must go forward in the coming weeks as we debate the importance of keeping
most enduring democracy. This very chamber where we're gathered today was breached, it was desecrated, as was the rest of the Capitol. This morning, in my capacity as President pro tem, I called the Senate into session. As I looked around the chamber, so many memories came to mind. I first saw this Senate chamber as a teenager, visiting from our home in Montpelier, Vermont, with my parents and my sister, coming to this Capitol. And then later, as a Georgetown law student, I would sit in the visitors gallery and just watch. I saw the members of the Senate in both parties speaking to the conscience of our nation, and trying to protect our Constitution. In 1975, I came onto the floor of the Senate as the junior-most member of this body. I was in awe of the Senate then. I never expected to become the dean of the Senate. But a year ago, I sat on the floor of the Senate as Vice President Pence was announcing the certification of ballots. I saw him doing this in a straightforward and honest way, even though he knew that at the end of the count, he would soon no longer be vice president, nor would Donald Trump be president. We were all in the Senate paying attention when suddenly officers came rushing onto the floor, and they took the vice president off the dais and out the door. Chuck Grassley, the then president pro tem, went to the dais and prepared to recess the Senate. Most of us, I remember looking around here, we were wondering what was happening until I saw a few feet from me. I saw a man wearing a vest that said police. On the Senate floor, he was carrying a submachine gun. I'd never seen anything like this in the U.S. Senate. And you recall, Mr. President, the police rushed us through a back door to the basement of the Capitol, and they shuttled us off to a secure location. I was still trying to sort through my mind what was happening. Officers were going through the halls, and one officer came along, took my arm, and he said, he said, we're going to watch out for you, Shamrock. So many memories flooded back because Shamrock was the police code name for me when I was a recipient of a deadly anthrax letter addressed to me that killed and maimed others. Ahead of me, I could see the brave parliamentarians and others who had grabbed their cases with the certification of ballots. They also grabbed the ivory gavel that is right in front of you now, Mr. President, the same gavel I used today to call the Senate into session. And when we were in the secure room, we were starting to see the television, we saw a mob, Americans who turned into a mob and turned their back on our nation's constitutional history. They were rejecting everything that made America great. They're ignoring our laws, our customs, and most of all, they're ignoring our history. The destruction, the rampage was something you'd see in a movie. I never expected to see it in the Capitol, a building that's always been a symbol of our democracy. And a suggestion was made when we were in the secure room that we use our authority under the law to vote and make the secure room the Senate chamber. I said, no, we should not be hiding here. Instead of it is safe to go back to the Senate, whenever it is, we should go back there, all of us, and have the American people see us there. I said it may take an hour, it may take 10 hours, but we should be there carrying out the Constitution and saying no criminals can destroy our history, our Constitution, our America. And I was relieved when virtually all the Republicans and Democrats who were in that room stood and said loudly they agreed with me. They would wait until we went back. I was standing next to the parliamentarian and the leather boxes carrying the certification of election. We both looked at them. And I'm sure we were both thinking the same thing. We will protect our Constitution. We will protect the Senate. We will protect America. And to the credit of the members of the Senate and the House, we reconvened after the siege. We fulfilled our constitutional duty to certify the confirmed results of the election, results that every state and federal court has upheld in the face of blatantly frivolous challenges. So my thoughts today are not only about how fragile our democracy is, but about the heroes of the day, the Capitol police officers, some of whom lost their lives or suffered grievous and enduring injuries, and those who joined in the Capitol's defense, especially from the Metropolitan Police Department. That day 1 year ago was such a sad and wrenching day. So disturbing was it to see such hatred and anger, to see the Confederate battle flag paraded in the Capitol, where it never was brought even during the Civil War, and to see Nazi emblems and other symbols of hate and violence carried by some of those in the mob. It was so horrifying to see our brave police officers, many of them war veterans who defended America in Iraq and Afghanistan, not just disregarded and disrespected, but brutally attacked, even by the wielding of poles bearing the American flag, used as bludgeons and spears. In the aftermath, National Guard contingents from several of our states were called in to protect the Capitol. I visited with members of the Vermont National Guard. I know many other senators did that with their state's Guard troops. In the moment, that night, and the next day, senators on both sides of the aisle called this out for the travesty that it was. But amnesia set in since then in some quarters. There's been a concerted effort to downplay or grossly mischaracterize the terrible events that day by some members in both chambers of Congress. It was not, as it's been said, just another day in January. What an insult to those who lost their lives and those who suffered injuries from which they still struggle to recover. And the question begs and answers itself. What are we in the Senate here for, if not to defend the Republic and our Constitution? There's a clear need for justice, and the courts are doing their essential work. There's a clear need to know the truth. And even some of the former president's closest supporters are heeding their duty to respond to the bipartisan congressional investigation to what happened that day. There will be a clear need to learn the lessons to safeguard and strengthen our democracy, to protect those who serve and protect the Capitol and those who work here. The courts are dealing with these crimes, but it is detestable how so many were so callously used as cannon fodder. Their actions were wrong, but many believe they are acting as patriots. The former president told them so and egged them on, and they believed him. Meanwhile, he and so many of his cronies, unlike many of his followers who stormed the Capitol, have paid no price for their roles. They must be held accountable for planning and promoting this travesty, and in his case, doing nothing to stop the assault, even when appealed to repeatedly by his closest advisors. The New York Times has observed our nation faces an existential threat from a movement that's openly contemptuous to democracy, has shown a willingness to use violence to achieve its ends. No self-governing society can survive such a threat by denying it exists. To deny it is to be complicit in what happened. But more than anything else, today is a day to remember, to feel sorrow that our great nation ever suffered such violence and division, to mourn those who died and were injured, and to mark the day as history will. The first time in 244 years that our exceptional country was almost prevented from carrying out a peaceful transfer of power, a sacred principle, a tradition in which we've taken pride for generations, and we've taken for granted throughout our entire lives, and that we have held up as an example to people everywhere. Now, our job in Congress is different than the prosecutors' roles. Democracy needs a foundation, and that foundation is nothing less than the truth. It's been said that trust in the rule of law is built in drops and lost in buckets. Our job is fundamental: to defend and advance the truth, to protect the rule of law itself. As Dean of this body, that's what I will do until the day I walk off this floor. Mr. President, I yield the floor. And I suggest,
Mr. President.
The Majority Whip and Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, a year ago today, we witnessed one of the worst assaults on our democracy in living memory. For those of us who were in the chamber, and that includes virtually every senator, there are images which are emblazoned in our memory. Mine, like others, was of a vice president sitting where you're sitting, who shortly after 2 p.m. in the afternoon was pulled off of the dais by two of his security detail and hurried out that door. It's an unusual thing to happen under any circumstances, but while we are counting the Electoral College returns, it was amazing and unprecedented. Then they came up and the Capitol Police instructed us, stay in your desks, this is going to be a secure room. We're going to start bringing in all the staff and they'll be lining the walls here. We'll keep you safe. Well, we all sat there in anticipation of the next thing to happen, and not 10 minutes later, another Capitol policeman came up and said that last directive is off. Evacuate this body, this room, as quickly and orderly as possible. And we all started piling out the doors. As we left and went down the exit stairways just outside the doors of this chamber, I looked out the window and saw a sea of Trump signs converging on the Capitol. It was an image I won't forget. We went to what we consider to be a safe location and witnessed over television what most of America was watching. How serious was it? Well, one misguided soul, a Republican congressman from Georgia, said it was just a group of tourists at the Capitol. Mr. President, yesterday the Attorney General of the United States, Merrick Garland, had a press conference and remarked on the first anniversary of January 6th. And among the things he said was, all of the investigations, the criminal investigations of what happened that day, have disclosed some horrible things. Evidence of perpetrators punching dozens of law enforcement officers, knocking them unconscious. Some perpetrators tackled and dragged law enforcement officers. Among the many examples of such violence, one officer was crushed in a door, another was dragged down a set of stairs, face down, repeatedly tased and beaten, and suffered a heart attack. Some perpetrators attacked law enforcement officers with chemical agents burning their eyes and skins. We saw it, didn't we? Spraying the bear spray into the faces of these officers. Some assaulted officers with pipes and poles and other dangerous and deadly weapons. Perpetrators targeted, assaulted, tackled, harassed journalists, destroying their equipment. And that launched the most comprehensive and perhaps largest criminal prosecution in the history of this nation. According to the Attorney General, 725 individuals have been charged with the federal crime. 145 pled guilty already to federal misdemeanors. Over 325 have been charged with felonies, many for assaulting officers and many for corruptly obstructing or attempting to obstruct an official proceeding. 20 defendants charged with felonies have already pled guilty, and the investigation continues. They talked about the assistance they've received, over 300,000 tips from ordinary citizens to help our government bring to justice those responsible for January 6th. I say that because I listen in disbelief to the polling data which suggests that it really wasn't an attack on the Capitol. It was only a visit of tourists who were in an orderly fashion visiting this building. The videos don't lie. The facts are the facts. Individuals are paying a criminal price and their lives will be changed because of their bad decisions to leave a Trump rally and follow his instructions to come up to this building. That is the reality of what happened that day, but the grimmest reality was the death of 5 of our law enforcement officials who have been named and should be named every time we stand on this floor. Officer Brian Sicknick, Officer Howard Liebengood, Officer Jeffrey Smith, Officer Gunther Hashida, and Officer Kyle DeFreitag, and 140 other law enforcement officials who were assaulted, many of them seriously and still paying a price for that day in their lives when they stood in defense of us, in defense of this building. That is the reality. And if nothing more comes of this speech and commemoration today, I hope that all of us, regardless of our political persuasion, the most conservative Republican to the most progressive Democrat, independents in between, black, white, and brown, men and women, rural, urban, across America, will finally come to an agreement on one thing. Violence has no place in a democracy. Those who resort to violence wherever they fit on the political spectrum do not fit on that spectrum, do not belong in this country. And what we saw a year ago today was violence unbridled, violence provoked by a former president of the United States. and many innocent people paid a price. I listened as the President and Vice President spoke this morning in Statuary Hall. It was a somber and meaningful occasion as they talked about what was at stake on January 6th and the challenge we face today. And I thought for a moment what a difference it would have made if, in fact, as the President spoke, Republican and Democratic leaders stood by his side. But that was not to be the case. You see, when the proposal was made for a bipartisan commission of Democrats and Republicans, commissions we've seen in the past for 9/11 and other events that marked our history, that was stopped by Senator McConnell, the Republican leader of the Senate, by the threat of a filibuster. He wouldn't agree to a bipartisan commission to look into the origins of January 6th and what we need to do to avoid them in the future. So I want to salute Speaker Pelosi for organizing a bipartisan committee in the United States House of Representatives who is investigating this matter. I want to salute my fellow congressman from Illinois, Adam Kinzinger, who's had the courage to step forward and be part of it, as well as Congresswoman Cheney of Wyoming, and the Democrats are part of that effort. They are serving this nation as they should, bringing forth the facts, fighting the resistance from those who don't want to tell the truth. But there's more that we must do. It's been mentioned several times and bears repeating. What is happening across America since January 6th is equally alarming to this assault on the Capitol. And that is the effort by dozens of states across the nation to restrict America's right to vote. To think of it, in that last election in 2020, we had the largest turnout in the history of the United States to cast votes in the presidential election. And the response by so many of these states controlled by Republican legislatures is to try to do their best to make sure that never happens again, to restrict the opportunity to vote for eligible Americans when we should be doing just the opposite. I've won elections and I've lost elections. And as long as they were fair elections, I accepted the results, and they all were. I was lucky. Sometimes I won, sometimes I lost. But I felt at the end of the day that there were fair elections. We should feel the same way about the election that occurred just last year before last, in 2020, with the election of Joe Biden as President of the United States. It was a fair election. It has been certified that way, not just by the election authorities in each state, but even by Donald Trump's Department of Homeland Security. And now we ought to take seriously what is about to occur with these states trying to restrict voting rights. I marvel at my colleagues on the Republican side who come to the floor and say, we have no right. We have no right to tell these states what their laws should be when it comes to elections. This little booklet is in each of our desks. I would commend to my colleagues, particularly on the Republican side, to consider opening it and consider reading Article 1, Section 4. I'd like to read into the record of the United States Constitution. The times, places, and manner of holding elections for senators and representatives shall be prescribed in each state by the legislature thereof, but the Congress may at any time by law make or alter such regulations except as to the places of choosing senators. Then you go further in and read the Bill of Rights and the amendments to the Constitution. The Article 15, Amendment 15, says the right of citizens of the U.S. to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Section 2, the Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. And yet Republican after Republican comes to the floor and questions how we could have the audacity to suggest that we're establishing standards so eligible voters across this country have an opportunity to vote. It is our constitutional responsibility to do it, and simply making that eligibility turn into an actual exercise of that right is consistent with our democracy. Mr. President, I know other colleagues are here to speak today. I will close by saying this. What brought that mob to this Capitol was the inspiration of a former president who provoked them, incited them, and turned them loose on this building. And now we're led to believe that he sat back and watched on television as the events unfolded, doing nothing, not picking up the phone, not calling on anyone to stop the violence, to stop the bloodshed, to stop the death that took place in this Capitol. He did nothing. for hours until finally enough forces came in to reclaim this building. When I have seen the images, the photographs and the videos of people who were clowning in this chamber, posing for photographs, going through my desk and other desks and others, taking photographs with their phones, sitting in that chair, posed for pictures to send back home, it makes me sick to my stomach. This is a sacred place. It is not sacred because I serve here or anyone else does. It's sacred because it was built to be a symbol of this great nation. It was during the administration of a man from Illinois named Lincoln, who completed the Capitol Dome in the midst of the Civil War, so that this building would always be a symbol of the unity of our nation and the promise of our nation. That symbol was desecrated on January the 6th, and now the question rises, will we summon the courage to come together and lead, to extend the opportunity to vote to more and more Americans, to make this democracy more complete and more just, or will we step back and accept the verdict of history that we are going to go back in time instead of forward as a nation? I trust we'll move forward. These American people are great people. Regardless of their political persuasion, they have one abiding knowledge, and that is the fact that we are blessed to live in this country, and we each bear a responsibility to its future. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Michigan.
Mr. President, I rise today along with colleagues to look back at a year ago, January 6th, 2021. I wish this was actually a bipartisan coming together today. A horrible, tragic day in our nation's history. But it's not enough to look back. We also need to look at what's happening today, because the threats against our democracy didn't go away when those black metal fences came down. Some of these threats against the democracy have found fertile soil right in this very chamber. January 6th, 2021 will go down in history as one of the worst days our nation has ever faced. It was disturbing, it was frightening, it was enraging. I know that I will never, ever forget it. Many people who were working here that day still carry scars. Some can be seen, and some can only be felt. The Capitol Police, the DC Police, the National Guard members, our other first responders, Capitol staff who were there that day are really heroes. And they deserve our thanks and our continued support. What we all witnessed that day was nothing less than a violent insurrection against the very seat of our democracy and our American form of government. It was sparked by a big lie, concocted by a political loser, and fueled by a network of his supporters. So let me take a moment to remind everyone that Donald Trump lost the 2020 election fair and square. In my home state of Michigan, in the middle of a pandemic, more people voted than ever before, 5.5 million people. And Michigan voters clearly and resoundingly chose Joe Biden to be our president and Kamala Harris to be our vice president. But instead of accepting defeat gracefully, like every other president in our history, Democrat or Republican, Donald Trump claimed that the election had been stolen from him. No one likes to lose an election. I've done both, winning and losing. It's not fun. But his election was not stolen from him. But this big lie has fueled an entire movement, people who will stop at nothing, including deadly violence, to undermine our Constitution and our country. They attacked our Capitol a year ago today on January 6th. They'll use and incite violence to disrupt future elections if they feel they need to. And now they're organizing on the state level to challenge the rules and take away people's freedom to vote. And tragically, our colleagues across the aisle are standing by and allowing this continuing attack on our democracy. We should be standing together, Democrats and Republicans, saying no to this assault on our Constitution and our country. Republicans said the right things that day. The senior senator from South Carolina said soon after the riot that he was humiliated and embarrassed for our country and that Trump should, quote, count him out. But a few short weeks later, Trump counted him in for 2 days of golf and dining at Mar-a-Lago. And then there's the Republican leader. He said that the January 6th riots were, quote, fed wild falsehoods by the most powerful man on earth because he was angry he'd lost an election. He added that Trump was practically and morally responsible for provoking the events of the day, and he was right. Then the Republican leader and the majority of Republicans voted no on impeachment. They opposed a bipartisan commission to investigate the events of January 6th. They blocked 3 bills to protect our freedom to vote. And they endorsed a Senate candidate who agrees with Trump that the 2020 election was stolen from him. In total, 147 Republican members of the House and Senate, 147, voted to overturn the results of the 2020 election. And a number of those 8 Republican senators still won't admit that Joe Biden is our duly elected president. Why am I focusing on this? Because our country has reached a critical crossroads. Either we are going to come together as Americans, defend our democracy, and look back on January 6th as a painful low point in our nation's history, or we can turn our power to a mob that is willing to do anything and say anything to dismantle our democracy and destroy this
Would my
grand
colleague yield
called
for a
America.
minute?
I would be happy to yield.
Okay, we're about to approach noon, where we'll have a moment of silence, not only in memory of those who were lost and those who were injured, but in all of the workforce here on Capitol Hill who worked through that day in a very, under dire circumstances. They did an amazing job, and in recognition of the great job they do for us every day. So we thank not only the floor staff, but all of those who work here. And with that, I think we'll commence the moment of silence, and after we finish, I'll call on Senator Klobuchar, Durbin, and then Senator Stabenow will resume, okay? So if we might now at 12 noon, well, it's a little before 12.
Yeah.
It's 2 minutes before.
Senator Schumer.
Senator Klobuchar, is your
Thank you
2
very
minutes?
much. I just
Senator
want
from Minnesota.
I want to recognize the heroic efforts of our staff, many of whom are here with us today, of our law enforcement, who in the face of overwhelming numbers and an unprecedented violent assault valiantly placed their lives on the line for this republic. It is also an opportunity to remember to recommit ourselves to making sure nothing like this ever happens again. As President Biden said today, our democracy held, we the people endured, we the people prevailed. And we devote this moment of silence to those who stood up, not only for this building, not only for the people that worked here, but for our very democracy itself.
A minute of silence, a moment of silence for all of those who have helped us then and help us now, the staffs and everybody else.
Under the previous order, the Senate will now observe a moment of silence in observance of the events of January 6th, 2021.
Senator Stabenow.
The senator from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me just conclude by saying that either we are going to come together as Americans, which I hope and pray we do, to defend our democracy and look back on January 6th as a painful low point in our nation's history, or we can turn over power to a mob that is willing to do anything and say anything to dismantle our democracy and destroy this grand experiment called America. The January 6th insurrectionists tried to overthrow our Capitol, and their sidekicks in suits and ties are trying to overthrow our elections. And just as we shored up our security here to protect the People's House, we need to upgrade our election laws to protect people's freedom to vote. Today is a day to remember, to be grateful for all of those who risked and lost their lives to protect us, to be grateful for all of those who stood up for our democracy and continue to stand up every single day. Today is a day to be grateful that we live in this great democracy called America. And it's a day to recommit ourselves to protect our freedoms for our children and our grandchildren. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Nevada.
Thank you, Mr. President. You know, this morning I've been listening to my colleagues, watching the news, watching our president, reflecting on this day a year ago and where I was during this incredible insurrection that we now know happened on the Capitol. You know, I was in my Capitol office here, as we all have an office here in the Capitol, and I was getting ready to come to the floor of the Senate and certify that Joe Biden had won the presidency in a free and fair election. Senior senator from Minnesota had organized many of us to stand in defense of that free and fair election, and I had been asked to stand in defense of the certified electoral votes in Arizona, and what I had been told they were going to challenge Nevada. It was a significant moment. Even before President Biden's victory, people had been spreading lies about the election for political gain, and I had planned to deliver a speech to combat those lies and explain in detail that the 2020 vote count was fair and accurate. And so, as I left my Capitol office and was walking to the Senate to deliver that speech, it became clear that something unprecedented was happening. Because on my way out of my Capitol office, I came across two of my colleagues, one of them here today, Senator Smith and Senator Murkowski. And they were standing outside an open door to a restroom that we share amongst our Capitol offices. And I asked them what was going on. And they said, there is a Capitol police officer in there. He's got something in his eyes, and he is flushing his eyes out with water. And I leaned in, and I saw the officer at the bathroom sink. And I thought to myself, and I said aloud to my colleagues, I think he's been pepper sprayed. And I asked him, has it been pepper sprayed? Have you been pepper sprayed? And he said, yes, but don't worry. Everything's fine. I am going to keep you all safe. And with that, he dashed back out the door, up the stairs, and outside to protect all of us and everyone else in this building. Now, I knew there had been a rally going on near the White House and that there were protests. What I did not know that morning was just how close the protesters were to forcing their way into this Capitol. Now, everyone knows what happened next. As we sat here, all of the senators, all of the staff that work with us day in and day out, our partners, the next thing we heard was this chamber being shut down by the Capitol Police, claiming that the Capitol had been breached. They told us to stay in our seats. This is the safest place where you can be right now, and we will protect you. And at that moment, we could all hear outside the doors. We didn't know what was going on because we can't see beyond this room what was happening outside, but we knew we could hear the voices and we could hear what was happening. And we also could hear outside of the one set of double doors that we call the hallway with the Ohio clock that leads to the rotunda, a lot of noise. And it was at that moment, as the noise was working its way towards the rotunda, that the Capitol Police officers then told all of us to get up and move quickly. And we moved out these opposite doors right here. Move as quickly as you possibly can. And that's when everybody came together. All of the senators, I don't care if we were Republican or Democrat, our floor staff that was with us, grabbing those electoral votes. And we all started going up and downstairs, through hallways, up and downstairs, through hallways, until we could get to a secure location. Now, as we were going through the hallways and when we got to this secure location, it was clear why this was happening. We were under attack because insurrectionists had been whipped into a frenzy by the false claim that the election in Nevada and in other states was fraudulent. That's exactly what the speaker said during that rally before the violence began. And we saw the same false claims in Nevada, where extremists tried to challenge our election results in an effort to prevent Joe Biden from becoming president. The former president's campaign and his supporters filed a total of 5 lawsuits challenging the security of the election system and targeting our state's Secretary of State in Nevada. Every one of those lawsuits was thrown out or failed, every single one of them in Nevada. And when the official tally was completed, President Biden won Nevada by 33,596 votes. The Nevada Secretary of State not only certified the election, she also investigated each and every claim of election fraud. And she made clear that her office found no evidence of widespread fraud. Now, I was the Attorney General of the state of Nevada for 8 years, and I can tell you from personal experience, when we find voter fraud, we prosecute it. And I also know there was, again, no widespread voter fraud in Nevada in the year 2020. And let me explain what widespread voter fraud means, because that is now being challenged by some of the former president's supporters. Widespread means that there was not enough to have changed the results of the election, that it was still a safe and secure election, and Joe Biden is our president. In fact, not only Nevada's elections were safe, accessible, and secure, but across the country they have been proven to be safe, accessible, and secure. I also want to share with the rest of the country that my state, in Nevada, we have enacted important protections for protecting voting rights, including automatic voter registration, vote by mail, early voting, and same-day registration. In the 2020 presidential elections, almost half of Nevadans, people from both parties, took advantage of our vote-by-mail laws. But because the defeated former president and his supporters were upset that he lost the election, some of them publicized the lie that he had won. And that lie, in turn, spurred members of the public to violence that resulted in 5 deaths and countless injuries. Now, we all know after the Capitol Police helped us move to safety, my colleagues and I from both parties talked about what to do. We knew the insurrectionists were trying to stop us from certifying the election, and we knew that we had to finish our jobs, no matter how late it was. And we all agreed that we had to go back to the Senate chamber so that we could show the rest of the country that we would not let our democracy be subverted by violence, that we would honor our Constitution and the peaceful transfer of power in this country. And I want to make this clear. I would have stood up to certify the valid results of the 2020 election, no matter who won. This isn't about partisanship. It's about patriotism. I took an oath to uphold the Constitution and protect it against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And nothing and no one will prevent me from doing that sworn duty. So I walked back to the Senate floor on the evening of January 6th to finish my work. I'll remember what I saw the rest of my life. As I walked back, furniture had been thrown everywhere like matchsticks. Trash, broken glass littered the floor. It was like a war zone. That night, I stood up and spoke in defense of our democracy, as I'd planned to do hours before. And at 3:42 a.m., Vice President Pence announced that Joe Biden was the president-elect. We honored the democratic transfer of power for the 59th time in American history. But I'm here to tell you, there is so much to do to ensure that there will be a 60th time. Our democracy is more fragile than it has been in decades. The same bad actors who fueled the violence in the first place, including the defeated former president and his supporters, continue to spread the big lie that the election was stolen. And they are using these false claims to pass legislation threatening our very democracy. Around the country, more than 400 state laws were introduced to restrict voting last year alone. In Nevada, we expanded vote-by-mail drop box locations, but in Florida, Georgia, Iowa, and Indiana, new laws make it harder to use those drop boxes. Nevada has same-day voter registration, but Texas just made it harder to register, not easier. And in Georgia, it's now even illegal to give food or water to people waiting in long lines to vote. And the list goes on and on. These are partisan laws. They're designed to favor one group of voters over another. That's not democracy. A real democracy honors everyone's right to be heard. It makes sure that everyone gets a vote and that every vote is counted. Democracy is a remarkable thing, a system where the people get to choose their own leaders. And we all need to stand up for it, just as the countless heroes of our history have done, from Elizabeth Cady Stanton to Abraham Lincoln to Martin Luther King Jr. So I will not stop fighting to protect our country and our democracy. I will continue working with my colleagues to pass voting rights legislation. We need to follow Nevada's lead and protect access to the polls. And we cannot let anyone silence America's voice in their own government. Now, Mr. President, I also want to recognize many of the heroes who protected us that day, like that Capitol police officer that I encountered that morning. After the attack was over, I learned that 140 of the police officers I passed in the halls of Congress every day had broken bones or worse. 4 of them later took their own lives. These are brave men and women who put themselves at risk every day to protect not just the people's elected representatives, but our dedicated staff and the hard-working people here at the Capitol, from the janitors to cafeteria workers to postal employees. All of these people carry their own memories of January 6th, and we need to make sure they never have to go through something like that again. So many of them are still here at the Capitol, still doing their jobs, like that Capitol police officer who I saw earlier who had been pepper sprayed. But I'll tell you what, they give me hope. And they remind me that all of us have a job to do, just like we did on January 6th. 1 year later, it's clear that we all must stand united in defense of our democracy. And Mr. President, I hope we can do just that. Thank you, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, a year ago, thousands of supporters of then-President Donald Trump, marching under banners supporting secession, conspiracy theories, and white supremacy, violently stormed the United States Capitol and breached the Senate and House chambers in hopes of overturning a free and fair election in which 7 million more Americans voted for President Biden. There was, of course, no proof and no truth to the claims of aberrant voting that Mr. Trump invented in order to fuel the mob. The assault on the Capitol was an attack on the United States and on democracy itself. We have the brave men and women of the U.S. Capitol Police to thank for defending the country against what can accurately be called an insurrection. And while the assault failed that day, thanks to the efforts of these officers and their partners from neighboring jurisdictions, an insidious campaign against our democracy continues through the baseless lies and antics of the former president and his associates. Mr. Trump set the events of January 6th in motion when he refused to say that he would accept the results of the November 2020 election. And he continued to value his ego over our democracy when he urged the mob to march on the Capitol and disrupt the election certification process. He repeatedly lied that the election he lost by 7 million votes had somehow been stolen, when the facts and the courts demonstrated that was clearly not the case. Stoked by this vitriol, Mr. Trump's supporters used pipes and flagpoles to brutally beat police officers. Some of the attacks were also directed at or planned to be directed at our own members in both the House and the Senate. And anyone who refused to subvert the election was a target of the insurrectionist mob, and that included Mr. Trump's own Vice President Mike Pence. And Mr. Trump, who lit the fuse and stood by, his actions sent a demoralizing signal to billions around the world as they watched his supporters assault the Capitol. 1 year ago today, the U.S. Capitol Police, federal, state, and local law enforcement partners, and the National Guard physically cleared and secured the Capitol buildings and grounds. The House of Representatives impeached Mr. Trump for his actions, yet most of the Senate Republican colleagues made tortured arguments that his actions were reprehensible but not technically impeachable. As a result, the democratically defeated former president continues his rhetorical assaults through lies and misinformation. He would rather rip our country apart and undermine our elections and democracy rather than accept the will of the American voters. The bipartisan House Select Committee on the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol is working tirelessly to get to the truth of that day. It is methodically collecting and following the evidence despite a lack of cooperation from Mr. Trump and his inner circle. The committee must continue to be transparent, and we must all continue to call out the repeated lies of Trump and his enablers. Every American, regardless of party affiliation, who believes in the right to vote and upholding the Constitution should want the truth about January 6th to come out. Congress must rise to the occasion. The stakes could not be any higher. Because of the former president's actions a year ago and his relentless lying since then, a significant minority of Americans now indicate that violence is an acceptable way to resolve political disagreement. We cannot afford to have such a sentiment persist. Together, we must accept the truth, restore trust in one another, and take steps to improve political discourse. One step we must take is to honor the officers of the Capitol Police, not just with our words, but with real support. Last year, we passed a supplemental appropriations bill that provided over $107 million in additional funding, including roughly $35 million for overtime, retention bonuses, hazard pay, and student loan repayments for officers. It also provided critical funding to address the trauma experienced by our officers and help support their mental health needs. But we can't stop there. We have to continue in this fiscal year's budget, 2022, to continue to support our police continue to support those who protect us. I'm afraid if we don't quickly resolve our differences that we could fall into the state of a continuing resolution, which would actually deny our police, the Capitol Police, and our security forces the tools they need not only to protect us and protect themselves, but also to sustain their morale, sustain their mental health, sustain their personhood. So I hope we can make progress, at least on that point, of reaching a budget solution on behalf of the men and women who protect us, who literally on that day gave their lives for us. Now, in addition to that, we have a critical role to play when it comes to safeguarding the rights of the American voter. And we have before us, with the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and the Freedom to Vote Act ready for passage, we have the opportunity, and the time is now. And I continue to urge my colleagues, both Republicans and Democrats, to work together to swiftly pass these critical voting rights bills that are needed to protect our elections and our democracy. We must bolster the security, accessibility, and transparency of our elections in order to mend the wounds of January 6th and begin to heal as a nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Mr. President, with that, I would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today with my colleagues, and I'd like to particularly thank my colleague, the senior senator from Minnesota, for bringing us together today. I rise today with my colleagues to commemorate the first anniversary of January 6th, the attack on our Capitol and the attempted coup to overturn our democracy. You know, I've thought a lot about this day over the last year, and I speak today because I think it's important that we are clear about what happened on January 6th, how it connects to what's happened since, and what needs to happen next. So let me be direct. On January 6th, there was a violent attack on the United States Capitol, led by insurrectionists with the explicit goal to overturn our free and fair elections and the election of Joe Biden. The attack happened because the former president, Trump, and his allies encouraged his supporters to come to Washington. They told them falsely that the election had been stolen. He incited them to violence, and then he sat and watched while the Capitol was attacked. These are the facts, and there was no attempt to hide it. It's as plain as that wintry January day. Now, I am sure that all of us in this room have vivid memories of what happened on that day. Moments of crisis leave a deep impression. And for us, of course, this violence happened in our workplace while we were doing our jobs. The Capitol on January 6th was full of members of Congress, national political leaders of both parties, and a vice president that the former president had exhorted his angry mob to hunt down. It was also, though, full of journalists, custodians, and cafeteria workers. In this chamber were our clerks and colleagues and parliamentarians and the stenographers who are here hour after hour making this place work. You are public servants thrown into violent chaos and danger by the former president. And law enforcement and first responders. Let's remember that January 6th was one of the worst days for injuries to law enforcement since 9/11, as a violent mob bludgeoned and crushed and wounded and killed. That's what happened, and no amount of whitewashing is going to change it. It also happened, Mr. President, that when we came back into this chamber to finish our jobs and to certify the people's votes, that some Republicans spoke the truth about the terrible tragedy of that day. Senator McConnell said, and I quote, "The mob was fed lies. They were provoked by the president and other powerful people." Senator Lindsey Graham, sitting right over there, declared in reference to the disgraced former president, quote, "Count me out. Enough is enough." So for a moment, It seemed like we would unify in condemning the political violence incited by a president who had betrayed our fundamental democratic principles. But later that night, Senator Cruz, Senator Hawley, and 6 other senators voted to overturn our free and fair elections, continuing down this reckless path. Within days, Republican Party leaders and right-wing media outlets began turning away from the facts of January 6th. Former President Trump was impeached for his seditious actions, but his hold on the Republican Party is so strong that only 7 Republican senators voted to convict. Republicans to this day continue to promote the big lie that the election was stolen from Trump. They claim that the people who stormed the Capitol with zip ties and bludgeons were tourists. They've attempted to portray the violent insurgents as martyrs rather than domestic terrorists. And this is why today, 58% of Republicans believe falsely that the election was stolen from President Trump. Now, the insurrection and the coup attempt on January 6th was ultimately unsuccessful. But this fight continues in state legislatures across the country, and they are prevailing. According to the Brennan Center, in 2021, 19 states passed laws restricting Americans' voting rights and giving partisan officials, Republicans, unprecedented control over the certification of election results. Their plan is right out there in plain view. Step 1 is to make it harder for some people to vote. Step 2 is to give partisans at the local level the power to ignore and overturn the people's votes. This is a coordinated strategy connected directly to the events of January 6th, and it is the path to overturning our democracy if we allow it. We cannot allow it. Through the January 6th Commission and through the Department of Justice, we must hold accountable those responsible for the crimes of that infamous day, including those at the top. And we need to pass the Freedom to Vote Act, which provides for basic standards for free and fair elections and fulfills the promise of our nation that in this democratic republic, the people decide. Now, not a single Republican senator is willing to join us Democrats in this endeavor, and that is a tragedy. Colleagues, I implore you, we cannot let Republicans hide behind Senate rules and block us from taking this common sense step to protect our democracy. In a democracy, a majority of the people decide. That's how it works in township meetings and city halls and county board meetings and in state legislatures, and that's how it should work in the United States Senate. We senators have the power to protect our democracy, and we have no excuse not to use that power. Now, on January 6th, I woke up early and I wrote down a few thoughts as I was heading to the Capitol. I had been sworn into office the 3rd time in 3 years, just a few days before. My husband, Archie, had been with me for the swearing in, and he'd headed home the day before. And as he left, he said, "Are you going to be okay?" And I said to him, "For sure. The United States Capitol is one of the safest places in the country. I'm going to be fine." Here's what I wrote this morning before I came to the Capitol. I wrote, "Today is a remarkable day. This morning I am filled with optimism. Georgians turned out in record numbers to elect Reverend Ralph Warnock to the United States Senate, pastor of Dr. King's home church. And it looks very likely that John Ossoff will be victorious, giving Democrats a majority in the Senate. And for me, this means that the work that Minnesotans sent me to do in Washington can actually get done. We will get through this day," I wrote that morning. "I truly believe our democracy is resilient and can withstand this desperate coup attempt. But it is a reminder of how hard we need to fight for our core principles, that no one is above the law, and that a democracy is when the people decide." Now, little did I know, Mr. President, but my optimism still holds, and my faith also still holds. My faith that we can be worthy of the promise laid out in our Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. That is our oath and our promise. Thank you. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise, as so many of us have done on this day, to do a couple things. Number one, to reflect and remember. That's important for so many reasons, but we're also here, I think, to express gratitude and commendation for so many who work in this building, the staff, the Capitol Police, and so many others who kept us safe 1 year ago today on that awful day. And I'll get to some other issues in a moment, but I want to start with just some reflections of what I remember about that day, but also what I think the country experienced on a day of horror and terror and desecration, a day when a group of Americans came to this building to stop the counting of the electoral votes. And they were told to do that by the then President of the United States. We know all the death that ensued from that, especially of law enforcement officers, and something on the order of 140 injuries, some of them grievous, permanent injuries to law enforcement, all based upon the violence, based upon a big lie, a deliberate falsehood that started long before even Election Day, started during the course of the 2020 election. But despite that big lie, and I don't want to spend all of today talking about that, but despite that big lie and the violence that flowed from that big lie and the near collapse of our democracy, despite that, we know that something on the order of 60 judges throughout the country, federal judges, state judges, appointed by Democrats, Republicans, and even some appointed by the former president, called out that big lie by rejecting the arguments based upon that big lie in about 60 different matters before those judges. So we know what happened, and I think the January 6th Commission will continue to put the evidence on the record and hold people accountable. But I think on a day like today, I want to focus on two issues. One is to express that gratitude that I mentioned before. The thousands of Americans who work in this building, the thousands who are not members of Congress who helped us on that day, everything from getting us to safety to making sandwiches for us when we were in a safe, secure room, something that basic. But of course, so many Americans now know, after all these months have unfolded, about the sacrifices made by so many on that day, especially law enforcement. But people in this building, who work in this building, have done so for years. They too were terrorized on that day. It wasn't just members of Congress and the nation more broadly. We even had the image, the horrible, disturbing racist image on television of an American walking through the halls of this building with a Confederate flag. Never happened before. Not even during the American Civil War had that happened. So when we talk about those who have done so much, here's what we're talking about. We're talking about people who suffered devastating injuries, as I said before, some of them lifelong. The emotional toll that this violence imposed upon members of the staff here in the building, both during the siege and its aftermath, is almost incalculable. So we're grateful for their service on every day of their work, but especially on that terrible day. I also want to thank, and we can't do this enough, we could do it 1,000 times and it wouldn't be enough, to thank the United States Capitol Police and the Metropolitan Police Department for all they did to protect us, to ultimately quell the violence, and to literally protect our democracy. These officers were bruised and beaten. They were attacked with bolts and bricks and bats and bear spray, as we saw so much, as well as stun guns. They had broken bones. They had concussions, chemical burns, scars, stitches, on and on. That's what violence does to a human being. They were also subjected to, those who happened to be black Americans in law enforcement or in communities of color, they were subjected to horrific racial epithets, the kind of language that should never be tolerated, not only here in the Capitol, but anywhere in our country. Some of them were even attacked by an American flag, by a flagpole with an American flag on it. So what this all adds up to is, unfortunately, not just a mob going into a building. This is about domestic terrorism. And I think it's an important day to be thankful that so many stood up to that domestic terrorism in law enforcement. So we offer both our gratitude and try, as inadequate as it is by mere words, try on a day like today to bestow some measure of both gratitude and commendation for what they did on that day. But finally, Mr. President, I think today is a day for resolve, to be determined to take action, legislative action. The best way we can do that is by passing the Freedom to Vote Act. That's the best thing we can do, not only for the next couple of weeks, but really it might be the most important thing that any of us work on. And I want to thank Senator Klobuchar and so many others who have worked on these issues, not just in the aftermath of January the 6th, but for thinking about the future of our democracy, literally the future of whether someone will have a clear pathway in the right to vote. The ability to vote in ways that so many Americans were able to vote in the midst of the pandemic. You know, there were a lot of people back in 2020 who said, oh, you know, in Pennsylvania you had a big turnout for president in 2016, but that turnout's going to go way down because it's a re-election and there's a pandemic and people won't vote and people will be afraid to vote. Guess what happened? We went from about 6 million votes in 2016 to almost 6.9 million votes. So almost 900,000 more people voted in Pennsylvania than did just 4 years earlier. Probably the highest turnout in more than 120 years in our state, just like it was for the nation. Now that didn't happen in our state just because people were more interested. It happened because we had pathways by way of a change in state law to allow them to vote. Very similar to what we're trying to do by enacting into law the Freedom to Vote Act. Being able to vote early, being able to vote by way of a mail-in ballot, having a drop box. What if you're 90 years old and you live in a rural area in Pennsylvania? We got 48 rural counties, by the way. What if you live in a rural area and you can't get to the county election bureau to drop off your mail-in ballot. Shouldn't you have a drop box if you're 90 years old and you want to vote? What if you live on a farm? What if you're running a farm and you've got a busy life, or you're running a small business? Shouldn't you have the opportunity to vote? Or should you just be restricted to one day in the year? One day per year, every year for a general election. And if you can't get to vote that day, then you're not able to vote. Why would we go back to those days? But apparently a lot of people in this chamber are supporting efforts all across the country, hundreds of voter suppression bills. As Reverend Warnock said, seems like some people don't want some people to vote. I don't understand that. After we had record turnout in Pennsylvania from 2016 to 2020, because we had different pathways for people to vote. That's what we're trying to do with the Freedom to Vote Act, to have national standards so people will have a chance to vote in the way that they want, in a way that's helpful in terms of their family life or their work life. But we're at a point now where the big lie is perpetuating itself in more ways than one. Let me conclude with one thought. My hometown newspaper, the Scranton Times-Tribune, published an editorial today, and I would ask, Mr. President, for consent to submit as part of the record and part of my remarks an editorial entitled, "Long Year After 1/6/21, It Continues," which is dated today.
Without objection.
I won't read all of it, obviously, but the point that this editorial makes is the attack continues today. It's not over. It's not some event in the past that we are just reflecting upon. As important as it is to reflect and remember and offer gratitude and commendation. But here's what the editorial says, and I'll just read a short portion of it. It says, "The attack continues," and I'm quoting. "It carries on in state houses like Pennsylvania's, where lawmakers continue to question the outcome of the 2020 presidential election, the most transparent and heavily scrutinized vote in our nation's history. Craft bills to diminish the sort of heavy turnout that carried Joe Biden to victory, waste public money on fraudulent searches for fraud, gerrymander congressional districts in the cause of minority rule." And it goes on from there, saying that the attack continues by all of this work to lie about the election of 2020 and to pass voter suppression bills all across the country. The good news, Mr. President, is that's not going to happen. We are not going to allow a partisan minority to prevent us from passing legislation to keep that pathway to the right to vote clear in the ways that it was clear, so that so many Pennsylvanians and many Americans, as I said in my home state, hundreds of thousands more voting in a pandemic than voted just 4 years earlier. So, Mr. President, on this day, when we remember with horror that day just a year ago, and we say thank you to those law enforcement officials and others who work in this building and did so much for us and for the nation, we also are determined to move forward, to protect our democracy and ensure that this great American experiment continues for generations. Thank you, Mr. President, and I would yield the floor.